Based on accounts. A reconstruction. Fictional story with motivational and educational purpose. He didn't ask for a raise. Didn't ask for a promotion. Didn't ask for recognition. He just tried to warn them. Minutes later, he was ignored. Months later, that financial decision changed the destiny of more people than he ever imagined. And those who laughed first were the ones who lost the most. There's a truth most people don't want to admit. The people at the bottom see everything. The ones serving your coffee, cleaning your office, standing in the corner while you make your big decisions. They see it all. Every contradiction, every inconsistency, every crack in the foundation that you're too busy, too important, or too proud to notice. And most of the time, they stay quiet. Because in a world built on hierarchy, your voice only counts if you're at the right level. And they're not. This story takes place in one of those restaurants you've probably seen. The kind with cloth napkins and waiters in bow ties. The kind where reservations are made weeks in advance and the wine list has pages you can't pronounce. A place where power meets regularly. Where deals get made over appetizers. Where the people who run the city come to feel like they run the world. And maybe they do. For a while. Until they don't. It's about a man who worked there. Not managing, not cooking, just serving. Invisible in the way that service workers are invisible. Present but not seen. Necessary but not valued. The kind of person you'd walk past every day and never remember. Except he remembered everything. Every conversation. Every number. Every detail that people assumed didn't matter because, well, who's paying attention? Turns out he was. And that attention would cost some people everything. Now, if you've ever worked in service, restaurants, retail, hospitality, anything where you're standing while others are sitting, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You hear things. Things people wouldn't say if they remembered you were human. You see patterns. You notice when the story changes. When the numbers don't add up. When someone's lying, even to themselves. But you also learn very quickly that pointing it out doesn't help. It just makes you a problem. So most people stay quiet. And this guy did too. For a while. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't a story about a hero. It's not about someone who fought the system and won. It's quieter than that, more real. It's about someone who tried to help, got humiliated for it, and then made a decision. Not out of revenge, not even out of anger, just out of clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize that the people you've been serving don't just ignore your advice, they ignore your existence. And once you see that, really see it, everything changes. What happened next wasn't dramatic. Not at first. It was financial, strategic, personal. It was a series of small choices that compounded over time. Choices made in silence while everyone else was busy being loud. And those choices, those quiet, invisible decisions made by someone nobody thought mattered, ended up mattering more than anyone expected. Because the truth is, money doesn't care about titles. Success doesn't care about status. And sometimes the people you overlook are the ones who see the clearest. This is a story about listening, about observation, about what happens when the invisible become undeniable. It's about financial decisions, made in whispers and consequences that arrive like thunder. It's about power and how fragile it really is. And most of all, it's about a waiter who didn't stay invisible forever. Not because he demanded to be seen, but because reality has a way of proving who was right. And proof doesn't need permission. So let's go back. Back to that restaurant. Back to the table in the corner. Back to the moment when everything started falling apart. And back to the man nobody noticed, until it was too late. He always came in at the same time. 6 in the evening, like clockwork. The black and white uniform was already there, hanging in the cramped back room, waiting for him like it was part of his body. Nobody really noticed. That's how waiters are, you know? They're there, but they're not. They serve, they clean, they disappear. The whole city passed through that restaurant. Important people. People with last names that show up in newspapers. And he was just another guy bringing the plate. Another guy collecting the tip without looking anyone in the eye. Just another one. But there was something nobody knew. He wrote everything down. Not in the order pad, no. In a cheap notebook. One of those hardcover ones that costs $5 at the corner stationery store. He wrote down what came in, what went out. He wrote down the rent. He wrote down what was left. When there was anything left. And there wasn't much, let me tell you. Very little, but there was something. And for him, that was already something. While others complained it wasn't enough, he made it work, quietly, organized. The routine was heavy. He woke up early because the bus didn't wait for anyone. He got to work, changed clothes, adjusted the tie that never sat right. Spent 8 hours on his feet, sometimes 9, sometimes 10. He'd get home past midnight, feet aching and head buzzing. Cold shower because the heater had been broken for months. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, open the notebook, write, close it, sleep. Nobody asked how he was doing. Nobody asked if he needed anything. He didn't ask either. It wasn't pride, no. It was just a way of being. He learned early that people who wait for others' attention end up waiting their whole lives. So he didn't wait. He did. He solved things. He figured it out. And when there was nothing to solve, he endured. Simple as that. No drama. No audience, but his eyes. His eyes paid attention to everything. While pouring water, he listened. While clearing plates, he observed. While pretending he wasn't there, he processed. People talked like he was furniture. Like he was a wall. And maybe that's exactly what he seemed like. But inside, man, inside he was always switched on. Always taking notes. Not on paper, in his memory. He knew the regular customers' names. Knew who ordered expensive wine to impress. And who ordered it because they actually understood it. Knew who treated the staff well and who didn't. Knew who was genuinely happy and who was just faking it. And he kept all of that, not to use against anyone, not to gossip, but because, I don't know, maybe it was the only way for him to exist in that space, watching, learning, growing on the inside, while on the outside he remained invisible. End of shift, he'd fold the uniform carefully, put it in the locker, grab his worn backpack, walk out the back door, the same one every day. Nobody waved. Nobody said, "See you tomorrow." He didn't say it either. He just left. And the next day, 6 in the evening, there he was again. On time, discreet, efficient, invisible. The back table was always theirs, reserved. There was no sign, no engraved name, but everybody knew. Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 at night, they'd arrive. 3, sometimes 4 men, impeccable suits, watches that cost more than a compact car. That attitude of people who've never had to apologize in their lives. They'd sit down, order the usual, good whiskey, light appetizer, main course without rush, and start talking, loud, always loud, like the entire restaurant needed to know they existed. They talked about numbers that didn't make sense to most people. Merger of this, acquisition of that, market going up, market going down, calculated risk, guaranteed return. They laughed a lot. Laughed in that kind of forced way, kind of automatic. The way we laugh when we want to show confidence but aren't necessarily feeling it. And they'd slap each other on the back and toast and make a point of making it clear that there, at that table, was the center of the city's financial universe. The waiter would pass by, serve, clear, come back. And to them, he simply didn't exist. It wasn't rudeness, no. It was worse than that. It was genuine indifference. You know when you don't even notice there's a person there? When you treat a human being like they're an extension of the salt shaker? Yeah, that was it. He could be bleeding from the nose and nobody would ask if he was okay. Because to ask, you need to see. And they didn't see. One of them was the worst. Not with yelling, no. Worst in silent contempt, he'd snap his fingers. Snap them, like this, without looking, without speaking, just snapped and expected you to come running. And the waiter came, not because he wanted to, but because he needed the job. Because he knew that complaining would cost him. Because he learned the hardest way possible. That people with power never pay for what they do. The one who pays is the one with no choice. And the entire restaurant operated around that. The manager would stop by the table, all attentive, asking if everything was perfect. The chef would come out of the kitchen personally to receive praise. The sommelier would hand-pick the bottle. Everything revolved around them, as if that space existed only to serve those who already had everything. And maybe it did, because at the end of the day, it was their money that kept the place open. It was their presence that brought status. And status in that place was worth more than respect. The waiter stood there, in the corner, out of focus, waiting to be called, waiting for the next finger snap. And while he waited, he listened, heard everything. The strategies, the plans, the risks they thought they were controlling. And sometimes, just sometimes, he'd notice things, small things, contradictions, numbers that didn't add up. Comments that repeated but with different versions. And he'd furrow his brow. But he wouldn't say anything. Because after all, who was he to speak? A waiter. A guy making minimum wage who depended on tips to make it through the month. A nobody in their view. And nobodies don't have opinions. Nobodies don't question. Nobodies just obey. So he'd go back to the kitchen, get the next order, and stay invisible. It was on a Thursday. He remembered because it was a heavy night. Restaurant packed, kitchen at its limit. The back table was there, as always. But that night, there was something different in the air. They were more agitated, more euphoric, talking about a big deal, really big. An operation that was going to change the game, according to them. And they laughed loud, drank faster, celebrated before it was time. And he, serving, listening, processing, felt a tightness in his chest. Because he'd heard that before. Exactly that. Only with a different number, different deadline, different guarantee. He stood still for a few seconds, tray in hand, staring at nothing, trying to piece things together. It wasn't the first time they'd talked about that subject. It had been about 3 weeks since the topic kept coming back. But every time it came back, the story changed a little. First, it was a safe investment. Then it was controlled risk. Now it was a unique opportunity. And the numbers, man, the numbers didn't add up. He didn't understand financial markets, no. But he understood logic, and that right there had no logic whatsoever. He finished his shift with that hammering in his head. Went home, opened the notebook. Not to write down expenses, no. To write down what he'd heard. Wrote the numbers he remembered, the dates, the company names, and looked at it like it was a puzzle. And the more he looked, the clearer it became. Something was very wrong indeed. And they weren't seeing it, or didn't want to see it, or thought they were too smart to be wrong. The next day, he arrived earlier, asked the manager for permission, said he needed to talk to the customers at the back table. The manager looked at him like he'd just asked to marry the boss's daughter. You? Talk to them? About what? And he explained, calmly, respectfully, said it was just an observation. That maybe it was nothing, but that he'd noticed a contradiction, and that he thought it was important to warn them. The manager laughed, but let him. Do whatever you want, man, but I'm not taking responsibility. When they arrived, he waited for the right moment. Waited for them to be served the appetizer. Waited for the mood to get lighter. Took a deep breath, approached, asked for permission, and spoke. Spoke quietly, politely, almost apologizing for existing. Said he'd overheard unintentionally the conversations. That it wasn't his business, but that he'd noticed the numbers from Tuesday didn't match today's. That maybe it would be good to review. That maybe there was some error. Silence, a thick silence. Heavy, embarrassing. And then came the laughter. Not from everyone, but from one, which infected the others. Mocking laughter, disbelief. You're giving me financial advice now, are you? One of them didn't even look at him. Kept cutting his steak. Another made a gesture with his hand like, you can go now. And the worst one, the one who snapped his fingers, he looked right into his eyes and said, thanks for your concern, but I think we know what we're doing. The tone wasn't aggressive. It was worse. It was condescending. It was like talking to a child who doesn't understand adult matters. He lowered his head, thanked them, went back to the kitchen, and stood there still, holding the sink, breathing slowly. It wasn't anger he felt. It was shame. Shame for exposing himself. Shame for thinking his opinion mattered. Shame for forgetting for 1 second the place he occupied in that world. He dried his hands, went back to the dining room, and continued serving. Invisible again. They didn't call him back. Didn't ask for clarification. Didn't even acknowledge what he'd said after that night. It was like the conversation never happened. Like he'd never opened his mouth. And maybe in their world he really hadn't. Words only count when they come from people who matter. And he didn't matter. So the next Tuesday, they came back. Same table. Same drinks. Same loud voices. And the deal moved forward. He heard them talking about signatures. About transfers. About timelines being locked in. About everything being set. He served them like always. Poured the water. Brought the bread. Cleared the plates. But something inside him had shifted. Not anger, no. Something quieter. Something colder. He stopped trying to make sense of their decisions. Stopped caring if they saw the risk. They'd made their choice. He'd made his attempt. Now all that was left was to watch and learn. Because if there was one thing he'd learned in that job, it was this. People teach you more by what they ignore than by what they say. The weeks passed. The calendar on the kitchen wall flipped pages. March became April. April became May. And he kept his routine. 6 in the evening. Uniform on. Tie never quite straight. 8 hours on his feet. Sometimes 9. Sometimes 10. But now, when he listened to their conversations, he wasn't trying to help anymore. He was studying, taking mental notes, watching how confidence turns into stubbornness, how certainty becomes blindness, how people who never admit mistakes end up making the biggest ones. One night, he noticed something. Their laughter wasn't as loud anymore. Their toasts weren't as frequent. One of them kept checking his phone. Another one wasn't eating much. The one who snapped fingers, he was quieter. Still arrogant, but quieter. And their conversations had changed. They weren't talking about opportunities anymore. They were talking about adjustments. about temporary setbacks, about market volatility. The words were different, but the message was clear. Something was going wrong. He didn't say anything, didn't even let his face show that he'd noticed. Just kept serving, kept clearing, kept being invisible. But inside, he was connecting dots. The contradiction he'd spotted wasn't small. It was structural, and now it was starting to crack, slowly, quietly. Like a building that looks fine on the outside, but has termites eating it from within. And they still didn't see it. Or maybe they did, but admitting it would mean admitting he'd been right. And that apparently was worse than losing money. Back home, he sat on the edge of his bed, opened his notebook. But this time, he didn't just write numbers. He wrote observations, patterns, lessons. People don't hear warnings, he wrote. They hear threats to their ego. He stared at those words for a long time. Then he turned the page and started writing something else, something different. A plan, not for revenge, not for vindication, but for himself. Because if he'd learned anything from watching them fall, it was this: the system doesn't protect you. So you better learn to protect yourself. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He made coffee, sat by the small kitchen table, and opened his notebook again. The plan was simple, almost too simple. But sometimes the best decisions are the ones that don't need explanation. He wasn't going to wait for them to fail. He wasn't going to wait for anyone to notice him. He was going to do what he'd always done. Take care of himself, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. He quit, not dramatically, not with a speech. He just walked into the manager's office on a Wednesday morning and gave 2 weeks' notice. The manager blinked twice, like he was trying to process something that didn't compute. You're leaving? Why? Did someone treat you badly? Do you have another job lined up? And he said no. No other job. No bad treatment. Just time to move on. The manager shrugged. Okay, your call. And that was it. No ceremony. No farewell party. Just a handshake and a good luck. Those 2 weeks felt strange. He still came in at 6. Still wore the uniform. Still served the back table. But something was different. He wasn't scared anymore. Wasn't worried. Wasn't hoping for anything from that place. He was just finishing what he'd started. Honoring his commitment. And watching, always watching. The men at the back table were getting quieter each night. Their phones rang more. Their conversations were shorter. And one of them stopped coming altogether. Just disappeared. Nobody mentioned it. But everybody noticed. On his last day, he folded the uniform for the final time. Put it in the locker. Took his things. And before he left, he did something he'd never done before. He walked past the back table. Not to serve, just to pass by. And one of them looked up. The one who'd snapped his fingers. Their eyes met for half a second. And in that half second, something passed between them. Not words, not apology, just recognition. The recognition that sometimes the people you don't see are the ones who see everything. He walked out, not through the back door, through the front, in the middle of service, in the middle of the noise and the movement and the life of that restaurant that had been his world for years. And he felt nothing. No sadness, no relief, just clarity, because he'd made a decision that most people never make. He'd walked away from security, from routine, from the known, not because he had something better waiting, but because staying would have cost him something more valuable than money, his self-respect. The money he'd saved wasn't much. Few months' rent, maybe less, but it was his. Every cent accounted for, every expense justified, and now he was going to use it. Not recklessly, not desperately, but strategically. He'd been watching those men make financial decisions for years, watching them win, watching them lose, and he'd learned something they never understood. It's not about how much you have. It's about what you do with what you have. And more importantly, it's about knowing when to move. He didn't tell anyone what he was planning, not because it was a secret, but because it didn't need explanation. He took the money from his savings, all of it, and he invested it. Not in their world, not in stocks or bonds or whatever they were always talking about. He invested in something simpler, something tangible, something he understood. A small food cart, the kind you see on street corners, the kind that serves coffee and sandwiches to people on their way to work. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive, just honest work, his work. The cart cost almost everything he had. He had to borrow a little from a cousin who asked too many questions. Had to negotiate payment terms with the seller. Had to learn permits and licenses and health codes. It was harder than he expected. Way harder. There were nights he couldn't sleep because he was terrified. He'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Nights he almost called the restaurant. To ask for his job back. Almost, but he didn't. Because deep down, beneath the fear, there was something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't make noise but keeps you moving forward anyway. It happened 3 months after he left. He was setting up his cart at 5 in the morning, like he did every day now, when his phone buzzed. A text from someone who still worked at the restaurant. Just 3 words. You were right. He stared at the screen. Didn't respond. Just put the phone away and kept working. But his hands were shaking a little. Not from cold. From something else. Vindication maybe. Or just the weight of knowing something you wish you didn't know. By noon, it was everywhere. Not on the front page, but buried in the business section. A small article. Dry language. Corporate speak. Local investment. Group faces significant losses. Following failed acquisition deal. Sources cite oversight in due diligence. Investigation pending. He read it 3 times. Each time the words felt heavier. Because those weren't just words. Those were lives, jobs, families, pensions maybe. All gone because someone didn't want to listen to a waiter who noticed something didn't add up. All gone because pride costs more than most people realize. The numbers didn't lie. They never do. The contradiction he'd spotted months ago had been real. The timeline that didn't match. The projections that were too optimistic. The risk that everyone called controlled but was actually just ignored. It had all collapsed. Not overnight, but slowly. The way these things always do. First a crack, then a leak, then a flood. And by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. The deal fell through. The money was gone. And the fallout was just beginning. He didn't feel happy about it. That's what surprised him most. He thought he would. Thought there'd be some satisfaction in being proven right. But there wasn't. Just sadness. Heavy, exhausting sadness. Because being right about something bad doesn't feel like winning. It feels like watching a car crash in slow motion and not being able to stop it. It feels like shouting into a void. And then watching exactly what you predicted come true. And nobody wins in that scenario. Not them, not him, nobody. Word got around fast. Small city, smaller circles. People started recognizing him. Not many, but enough. Someone would stop by his cart and say something like, "Hey, didn't you used to work at that restaurant? The one with those guys?" And he'd nod. Keep making the coffee. Keep his face neutral. And they'd say, "Man, what a mess, huh?" And he'd say, "Yeah, it is." And that would be it. He didn't elaborate. Didn't tell the story. Didn't say, "I told them so." Because what's the point? The proof was already there. Public, documented, undeniable. The restaurant changed after that. Different management. Different clientele. The back table wasn't reserved anymore. Just another table. He heard from someone that most of those guys left the city. Couldn't face it anymore. Couldn't face the questions, the looks, the whispers. One of them supposedly tried to make it right. Tried to recover some of the money. Tried to rebuild. But the trust was gone. And without trust, nothing stands. Not businesses. Not reputations. Not futures. He thought about them sometimes. Late at night, after closing the cart. Sitting in his small apartment with a cup of tea, staring out the window. He wondered if they ever thought about him. If they ever remembered that Thursday night when he tried to warn them. If they ever connected the dots. Probably not. People rarely do. It's easier to blame the market. Blame timing. Blame bad luck. Anything except the moment when someone tried to help and they chose not to listen. That's the hardest thing to admit. So most people don't. They just move on and pretend it never happened. 6 months later, everything looked different. Not the city, not the streets, just the positions. The men who used to sit at the back table, ordering without looking at prices, snapping their fingers like the world owed them attention. They were gone. Not all of them, but most. One moved to another state. Another took a job that paid half what he used to make. The one who snapped his fingers, he was still around. But quieter. Way quieter. Walking with his head down. The kind of walk that says, "Please don't recognize me." And him? He was still at the corner. Same spot. 5 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. Every single day. But the cart wasn't struggling anymore. It was working. Actually working. Not making him rich, no. But making enough. Enough to pay rent on time. Enough to save a little. Enough to sleep without that knot in his stomach. Wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. People came back. Regular customers. They knew his name now. Actually knew it. Asked how he was doing. Meant it when they asked. The recognition didn't come as applause. It never does in real life. It came as respect. Quiet respect. The kind you earn by showing up. By being consistent. By doing what you said you'd do. People in the neighborhood started recommending his cart. Best coffee on this side of town. Guy's reliable. Always there. Word of mouth. The oldest currency. And the only one that actually matters when you're building something real. Something that lasts. One morning, someone from a local business blog stopped by. Wanted to do a story. Small business success type thing. Asked him how he did it. How he went from waiter to entrepreneur. And he almost laughed. Because entrepreneur sounded too fancy for what he was doing. He was just selling coffee. Just making sandwiches. Just working. But the blogger insisted. Kept asking about strategy. About vision. About goals. And finally he said, I just paid attention. And when I saw an opportunity, I took it. That's it. They published the article. Small piece. Nothing major. But people read it. And some of those people were people who used to ignore him. People who used to see him as furniture. And now they were reading about him. Learning from him. Asking him for advice. The irony wasn't lost on him. But he didn't rub it in. Didn't gloat. Didn't even mention it. Because that's not what this was about. This was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could do it. That he could build something. That his observations, his discipline, his quiet persistence actually meant something. The power shift wasn't loud. It was almost invisible. Like most real changes are. But it was there. He didn't need their table anymore. Didn't need their tips. Didn't need their validation. And they, the ones who stayed in town, the ones who were rebuilding, they saw him differently now. Not as the help. Not as the guy who brings the food. But as someone who made it work when things got hard. Someone who took a risk and didn't collapse. Someone who survived. And survival, especially when nobody expected it, commands a different kind of respect. He stood behind his cart every day. Same spot, same hours, same uniform basically. Apron instead of a tuxedo shirt, but still a uniform. Still serving people. But the difference was everything. Because now he was serving on his terms, in his space, with his rules. And that small shift from serving their world to building his own, that was the inversion. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. And somehow that made it more powerful than any revenge could ever be. He saw him on a Tuesday, early morning. The cart was just opening, steam rising from the coffee machine, the sun barely up. And there he was, the one who snapped his fingers, standing across the street, just standing there, not moving, not approaching, just looking. Their eyes met. And for a moment, time did that thing where it slows down, where everything else disappears and it's just you and that person and all. The history between you hanging in the air like smoke. The man looked different, older, thinner, the suit wasn't as sharp. The confidence wasn't there anymore. He looked like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for too long. And maybe he had. Maybe guilt weighs more than people think. Maybe regret has actual physical mass. The man took a step forward, stopped, took another step, stopped again. Like he was trying to decide something. Like he was building courage to cross. A street that suddenly felt wider than it actually was. He could have turned away. Could have pretended he didn't see him. Could have busied himself with something, anything, to avoid the moment. But he didn't. He just stood there, waiting, not with anger, not with smugness, just with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you don't need anything from the person walking toward you. The man finally crossed the street, stood in front of the cart, opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Can I get a coffee? Sure, he said. How do you take it? The man almost smiled. Almost. Black, no sugar. He made the coffee. Same way he made every coffee. With attention, with care. Poured it into a cup. Handed it over. The man reached for his wallet. How much? $3.50. The man pulled out a bill. Their hands touched briefly during the exchange. And in that touch, there was everything that didn't need to be said. The apology that couldn't be spoken. The acknowledgement that should have come months ago. The respect that was always there but never shown. The man took a sip, stood there for a moment, then said quietly, "You were right. About everything." And he could have said so many things. Could have said, "I know." Could have said, "You should have listened." Could have listed everything that happened. Everything that fell apart. Everything that could have been avoided. But instead he just said, "Yeah, I was." Not cold, not warm, just factual. Because the truth doesn't need decoration. It just needs to exist. I wanted to say, the man started. But he held up a hand, gentle, not aggressive, just enough. "You don't have to," he said. "It's done. What happened, happened. You're here now. That's enough." The man's eyes got wet. Not crying, just close. He nodded, took another sip. "This is good coffee." "Thanks." They stood in silence for a minute, maybe two. Then the man put the cup down. "Take care of yourself." "You too," he said. And meant it. Actually meant it. The man walked away, didn't look back, and he watched him go. Watched him disappear into the morning crowd. And then he turned back to his cart. Wiped down the counter, prepared for the next customer. Because that's what you do. You move forward. You don't carry what isn't yours to carry. The man had come looking for something. Forgiveness maybe. Or closure. Or just a moment of humanity in a world that had become very hard. And he'd given it. Not because the man deserved it, but because holding on to it would have cost him more than letting it go. That night, sitting in his small apartment, he thought about the empty table. Not the one at the restaurant. The one in his mind. The one where all the anger and resentment and bitterness had been sitting for months. And he realized it was empty now. Actually empty. Not because he'd forced it. Not because he'd worked through some process. But because somewhere along the way, without even noticing, he'd let it go. And the lightness he felt wasn't dramatic. Wasn't life-changing. It was just peaceful, like setting down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying and walking away, free. So here we are, at the end of a story that's really just the beginning of a question. A question you need to ask yourself. Not out loud, not to anyone else, just to yourself. In the quiet moments when nobody's watching, and you don't have to pretend anymore. The question is this: how many times have you been right and been ignored? How many times have you seen something clearly, spoken up carefully, and been treated like you didn't matter? Like your perspective was cute but irrelevant. Like you didn't have the credentials, the title, the position to have an opinion that counts. Maybe you felt it at work. Maybe you felt it in your family. Maybe you felt it in your own head, where that voice keeps telling you that you're not smart enough, not experienced enough, not important enough to trust what you see. And here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. Sometimes the problem isn't you. Sometimes the problem is the room you're standing in, the table you're serving, the people who have the power to listen but choose not to. Because listening would mean admitting that status doesn't equal insight. And for some people, that's too expensive to admit. This guy, this waiter, he didn't have a degree in finance, didn't have a corner office, didn't have a LinkedIn profile full of endorsements. He just had eyes, and a brain, and the discipline to pay attention when everyone else was too busy performing. And that was enough. Not to prevent the disaster. Because you can't save people who don't want to be saved, but enough to save himself. Enough to see the cliff before he walked off it. Enough to make a different choice when everyone around him was making the same bad one. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that you'll always be heard. You won't. Not that you'll always be respected. You won't. But that you can always choose to listen to yourself. You can always choose to act on what you know to be true. Even when the world tells you you're wrong. Even when people laugh. Even when you're standing alone. Because here's what nobody tells you about being right when everyone else is wrong. It's lonely. Really lonely. Until it's not. Until reality catches up. And then, suddenly, you're not alone anymore. You're just ahead. The financial part of this story matters. It matters a lot. Because money amplifies everything. It amplifies wisdom when you have it. It amplifies stupidity when you don't. And the people in this story who lost, they didn't lose because they were dumb. They lost because they were proud. Because they confused their position with their competence. Because they thought that having money meant they understood money. And those are two completely different things. You can inherit wealth. You can stumble into opportunity. You can even fake expertise for a while. But you can't fake discipline. You can't fake observation. And you can't fake the humility to admit when someone else might see something you don't. So what do you do with this? How do you apply a story about a waiter and some arrogant executives to your actual life? Simple. You start paying attention, not to what people say, to what they do, not to their titles, to their patterns. You start trusting your instincts, even when they contradict the room. You start valuing your own clarity over other people's confidence. And most importantly, you start making decisions based on what you see, not on what you're supposed to see. Because the system, whatever system you're in, doesn't reward truth. It rewards compliance. And if you want something different, you have to be willing to step outside the system. Even when it's scary. Even when you don't have a backup plan. Even when everyone's telling you you're making a mistake. The problem was never lack of money. It was lack of direction. Lack of clarity. Lack of the courage to walk away from what's familiar and move toward what's right. Money follows clarity. Success follows discipline. And freedom follows the willingness to let go of what no longer serves you, even when it's all you've ever known. This guy, he wasn't special. He wasn't lucky. He just paid attention. And then he acted. That's it. That's the whole formula. See clearly. Act decisively, repeat. Now I want to hear from you. Because I know some of you are sitting there thinking, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. You tried to speak up. You tried to warn someone. You tried to share what you saw. And you were dismissed, ignored, maybe even humiliated. So here's my question for you. And I really want you to answer this in the comments. Have you ever been ignored even though you were right? And what did you do after? Did you walk away like this guy did? Or did you stay, hoping things would change? I'm genuinely curious. And if this story hit you, if something in it felt familiar or true or just worth thinking about, do me a favor. Share it, not because I need the views, though I'll take them, but because someone in your circle needs to hear this. Someone sitting in a situation right now where they feel invisible, where they feel like their voice doesn't matter. And maybe this story reminds them that it does. That clarity is power. That observation is valuable. That you don't need permission to trust what you see. Before you go, there's another story I think you need to hear. It's about someone who was fired quietly, let go without explanation, treated like they didn't matter. And months later, the same people who let them go came back. Not to apologize, but to ask for help. Because turns out, they couldn't function without the person they thought was replaceable. It's called He Was Fired in Silence. Months later, the system begged for help. You'll find it right here on the screen. Click it, watch it. Because if this story made you think, that one's going to make you feel something different, something stronger. And hey, if you made it this far, if you stuck with this whole story, do me one last favor. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because I make videos like this regularly. Stories that don't just entertain, stories that teach, that challenge, that make you rethink the way you see money, work, people, power. And I promise you, if you like this, there's a lot more where it came from. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And remember, just because they don't see you doesn't mean you're invisible. You're just early. And early always looks wrong, until it's proven right.